in the vast records of the Imperium's Great Crusade history, the bond between Ferrus Manus and Fulgrim, respectively the Gorgon and the Phoenician, stands as a tale of shared brilliance and profound camaraderie. Their legendary friendship, forged amidst the roaring furnaces of Terra's great forge, would be immortalized evermore, as being a friendship only rivaled between that of Horus Lupercal and Sanguinius. The fateful meeting between these two great primarchs occurred beneath Mount Norinda, within the mightiest forge of the Urals, and what was a bastion of industry that had once served the Terrawat clan during the Unification Wars. Ferrus Manus, recently arrived from Medusa, was immersed deeply within his craft, demonstrating his nigh unrivaled skill and near miraculous precision granted to him by his living metal hands. His work astounded even the veteran forge masters who toiled alongside him, their awe bordering on reverence for the Primarch's mastery of metallurgy and engineering. Into this entered Fulgrim, the Phoenician, accompanied by his elite Phoenix Guard. The Primarch of the Emperor's Children carried himself with a regal bearing of one accustomed to adoration and perpetual victory. Despite the aura of competition that might have flared between these two titanic figures, there seemed to be no hostility. Instead, an unspoken understanding quickly passed between the two, a recognition of their shared genius and common reverence of the alchemical sciences that had played a role in their own creation, along with a love of the forge. The artisans present trembled at the two Primarchs exchanging words, fearing that this meeting of giants might descend into conflict. Ferrus Manus would later recount to his legion how Fulgrim, with his characteristic confidence, proclaimed his intent to craft the greatest weapon humanity had ever seen, a tool that would embody the perfection his legion sought to emulate. Ferrus, however, dismissed Fulgrim's claim with a booming laugh, mocking his brother's pasty hands as unworthy of such an endeavor, compared to his own living metal limbs. Fulgrim, unperturbed by this jest, accepted the challenge with a smile as radiant as his reputation. Stripping to their waists, the two Primarchs set to work in the forge, surrounded by the roaring heat of the furnaces and the incessant clamor of hammer-striking anvils. For weeks, the forge echoed with relentless cadences of their labor, punctuated by good-natured taunts and a hiss of cooling metal. The artisans watched in awe as these two titans, these demigods, bent raw metals with their wills. Their every movement was a display of transcendent skill. 3 months of unyielding toil would culminate in the creation of two unparalleled weapons. Fulgrim would unveil Forgebreaker, a mighty warhammer capable of shattering mountains with a single strike. Its craftsmanship was a reflection of Fulgrim himself, elegant yet devastating, whereas Ferrus Manus presented Fireblade, a golden sword that burned eternally with a fiery essence drawn from the very forge it was born in. The blade itself was a testament to his relentless pursuit of strength and functionality, its design both flawless in form and purpose. Yet in a moment that revealed the depths of their shared respect, each Primarch declared the other's creation superior. Fulgrim likened Fireblade to the fabled weapon of Nadula Silverhand, a blade fit for a hero of legend. Ferrus in turn proclaimed that Forgebreaker could only be wielded by the thunder gods of Nordic myth. Without hesitation or further debate, the two exchanged their weapons, each carrying the mark of their brother's genius into the Great Crusade from there on. This act of mutual admiration and the exchange itself would symbolize the profound connection between the Gorgon and the Phoenician. Their friendship, forged within the forges of Terra, would endure as one of the Imperium's most storied alliances. For Ferrus Manus and Fulgrim, the forge was not merely a place of creation. It was a crucible where their bonds would be tempered, a testament to the unbreakable link between these two extraordinary beings, shaped by fire, metal, and the shared dream for humanity's ascension. Amongst the many legendary weapons created during the Great Crusade, Forgebreaker is still renowned as one of the most formidable and awe-inspiring ever crafted. Forged by Fulgrim, the Primarch of the Emperor's Children, it was not merely a weapon, but a symbol of power, artistry, and determination, which would forever mark the bond between the two brothers, one that would eventually be shattered. The sheer weight of Forgebreaker was so immense, only an Astartes enhanced by the Emperor's genetic mastery could wield it with great strain, and a Primarch could with some relative ease. Its haft was as dark as the deepest of ebonies, and it was interlaced intricately with both gold and silver filigree. The patterns forged into the hammer itself formed an image of a lightning bolt, a symbol of both divine power and wrath, which it seems Fulgrim believed would best reflect his brother's character. At its head was a mighty eagle, its beak fashioned into a deadly striking face, and its wings tapering into brutal claws. And this great beast was carved with such a perfection that it seemed to pulse with life. For anyone who gazed upon Forgebreaker, they could feel its power, a force that resonated from deep within the weapon, compelling both awe and reverence to be bestowed upon it by all those who witnessed it. It was not merely a tool of war, but rather it was a physical manifestation of the bond Fulgrim at the time felt with Ferrus, embodying the ideals of loyalty, honor, death, and the vengeance humanity would wreak upon the stars, along with the unbreakable bonds of brotherhood. In the eyes of the Iron Hands, it was a living legacy and a tribute to Ferrus Manus and the friendship he shared with Fulgrim, and it would become a symbol of the undying, unyielding strength and the alliance that would lead the two legions to so readily work with one another. It is from this shared bond that the name Gorgon would come to haunt Ferrus Manus. While many believe the title was a direct reference to the terrifying creature from ancient Terran mythology, the truth is far more personal, and perhaps more telling of the relationship between Ferrus Manus and his brother Fulgrim. The Gorgon in myth was a creature so hideous that its very gaze could turn men to stone, which it seems Fulgrim believed was a fitting metaphor for the brutal and unyielding nature of Ferrus Manus. But perhaps this interpretation was more of an afterthought. The name's true origin seems to lie in a personal moment, one that occurred shortly after the two Primarchs met beneath the mountain. Upon their return to the Imperial Palace, Ferrus Manus and Fulgrim encountered Sanguinius, the noble and elegant Primarch of the Blood Angels, who had brought with him wondrous gifts for the Emperor. The artifacts were exquisite, beautiful statues crafted from the glowing rocks of Baal, gem-encrusted treasures of the highest order, and rare minerals such as opal, tourmaline, and agrogranite. To Fulgrim, the delicate beauty of these items was a perfect reflection of his own love for art and culture. Yet for Ferrus Manus, these wonders had little appeal, as he saw them as little more than distractions, a waste of precious time in a galaxy that demanded conquest and survival. Amused by his brother's indifference, Fulgrim jested that Ferrus was a terrible Gorgon, a being so impervious to beauty that he could not appreciate the very stars he fought to reclaim. The insult, while lighthearted, stuck. To those who knew Ferrus Manus the best, the name was a mark of shame rather than a badge of honor. For the Gorgon was no mere creature of myth, but a warrior, unrelenting and unyielding in his pursuit of the Emperor's very grand design. It was a name forged in a crucible of brotherhood, and, regardless of how he may have acted, it was a testament to Ferrus Manus' singular focus on the task at hand. Thus, the title, the Gorgon, became irrevocably tied to Ferrus Manus. It was a title not given by his enemies, but by a brother whose wit and fondness for beauty could not dissuade him from seeing Ferrus for what he truly was, a figure of formidable strength, tempered by the iron resolve that would shape the Iron Hands and define his legacy throughout the Great Crusade.
You are all my sons, and the fires of the forge burn as hot in your hearts as they do in mine. Chain them, master them, and you shall wield a deadly weapon, but allow them to rule you, and you shall be lost.
Excerpt from Ferrus Manus' address to the 10th Legion before the Great Crusade. Under the expert guidance of their Primarch, Ferrus Manus, the 10th Legion would transform into the epitome of a war machine, cold, efficient, and a perfect instrument of destruction. Where the other legions might find beauty in the chaos of battle, the Iron Hands embraced the brutality of precision and order. They would become, more than any other, a literal war engine, a literal engine of war, a purpose-built force designed to destroy in the most direct and relentless manner possible, at the greatest efficiency they could. This transformation, orchestrated by Ferrus Manus, was rooted in his vision for the legions. His command forged a path where warfare was not an art, but a methodical and unstoppable force, guided by reason, discipline, and technological mastery. Under Ferrus Manus, the Iron Hands would take pride in their overwhelming superiority, in particular of their weaponry. War gear and combat techniques were also highly attuned to his grand design. The Legion would often be characterized by its cold precision, as they were not only valued for their warriors' physical power, but for the intellectual and technological prowess of the Iron Hands. Said technological expertise became as crucial as bravery and discipline. To the Iron Hands, victory was not something earned through heroism or grace, but through efficiency and ruthlessness. Their mission was simple: to become the hand that reached out and crushed the enemies of humanity, as cold, unfeeling, and implacable as the very metal that coursed through their Primarch's arms. From the very outset, Ferrus Manus' rule was uncompromising and without question, as he became a harsh yet constant overlord, a father figure who demanded perfection from those who served under him. Like the Iron Hands themselves, he was a creature of extremes, swift to anger, unflinching in his expectations, but also rigid of control. His wrath was always close to the surface, yet it was tempered by rationality and his methodical nature, as if his fury was another weapon to wield, precisely when needed. In the eyes of his legion, he was not merely a leader, but a living myth, the Gorgon itself, a figure of monumental stature, as his deeds were legendary. To them, this title, originating from his myth-like nature, resounded more to the 10th Legion than its true origin, as it reflected their Primarch's superhuman strength, intelligence, and perseverance. And the legends about him grew as he proved time and time again that his mere gaze, as cold and unyielding as metal, showed that he understood war better than any of his brothers. Ferrus Manus was quick to scorn and slow to offer praise, as he set standards for his legion that were nothing short of unreachable. The warriors under his command were not just soldiers, they were extensions of his will and body, as there was no room for mediocrity or failure within his legion. And this message was hammered into the heads of each and every warrior from the very moment they were inducted to the second they would die. The very strength of the legion came from this brutal creed. Weakness was the ultimate sin. Just as Ferrus Manus had done on Medusa, where he had purged weakness from his dominion, so too would he cleanse his legion and the worlds they conquered of weakness. Failure in the eyes of Ferrus Manus was intolerable, and to the Iron Hands, failure was synonymous with weakness. Weakness, in turn, was the greatest threat to the survival of humanity, a threat that they believed had led them to the catastrophic terrors of Old Night. On Medusa, weakness perished, dragged down by the harsh environment and the unforgiving trials of survival that had so long existed on the world. There, the strong survived and the weak were left behind. This mindset was harsh and would be transplanted into the Iron Hands' belief system, where the survival of the Legion, nay, the survival of the Imperium, relied on eradicating all traces of weakness. The warriors of the 10th Legion had internalized the harsh creed that failure was not to be tolerated, and that any form of weakness must be purged, regardless of its origin, to an extreme. This ideology extended to all members of the Legion, including their aspirants. Any sign of frailty in the ranks, any failure to meet standards set by Ferrus Manus, was met with swift and unforgiving punishments. The warriors of the Iron Hands were shaped into an unbreakable force, a tribe of ascendant warriors, forged in the very crucible of discipline that Ferrus Manus had dipped his hands in. They believed that only the strong had the right to carry the Emperor's will, and they believed that it was through this crucible that they would become strong. The severity of Ferrus Manus' creed left an irremovable mark upon the Iron Hands, one that they would carry to this very day. They were not just a legion of warriors, they were a living embodiment of the Primarch's will, a will that could never be swayed by weakness, and a strength that could never be broken. His warriors fought not for glory or honor, but because they understood, as Ferrus Manus did, that victory could only be secured through perfection, discipline, and the will to conquer. Through Ferrus Manus, the Iron Hands became more than just soldiers. They became an unstoppable, unyielding force, a weapon honed by years of sacrifice, fearlessness, and the purest embodiment of discipline. Under the steadfast leadership of Ferrus Manus, The 10th Legion would quickly become the heart of the 52nd Expeditionary Fleet during the Great Crusade. With their Primarch, the Gorgon, at their helm, the Iron Hands distinguished themselves as one of the most formidable and efficient weapons in the Emperor's nigh unending arsenal. Known for their ruthlessness and their mastery of high-intensity combat, along with their cold and calculating approach to warfare, the Iron Hands would quickly gain a reputation as one of the Great Crusade's most reliable and decisive legions. Their battlefield tactics were not just efficient, they were absolute perfection, designed to win through force, precision, and unending pressure. The Iron Hands would prove themselves especially effective against enemies that demanded direct confrontation, such as the Orcs, whose overwhelming numbers and sheer physical prowess posed a significant threat to the success of the Emperor's great design. The 10th Legion's abilities in these brutal engagements would be amplified by their understanding of technology in both terms of their own superior war gear and their ability to counter, adapt, and adopt the weaponry of their enemies into their own equipment. These qualities made them an indispensable tool for the Emperor. As such, the Iron Hands would be swiftly deployed in critical campaigns, often engaged in set-piece battles against technologically advanced foes and large organized Xenos forces. The Legion's combat style thrived in the midst of battle, where the fighting was at its most intense, and it was there on these battlefronts that they would cement their reputation as the Great Crusade's most direct and unyielding, unstoppable force. Recognizing the Iron Hands' prowess, the Emperor strategically positioned them in some of the most difficult and dangerous sectors of war. The challenge of engaging in mass battles against opposing war machines and advanced armies would only help to hone the 10th Legion's effectiveness. As the Legion's reputation for efficiency grew, so did the demand for their services. The Iron Hands were called upon time and time again to engage with enemies that would otherwise overwhelm less specialized forces, especially in battles against human factions that clung to the remnants of lost Dark Age of Technology weaponry. These factions, resistant to the Emperor's unification efforts, represented a particularly dangerous threat to the success of the Great Crusade. The nature of these high-intensity engagements also required the Iron Hands to work rather closely with the Mechanicum and the Titan Legions, an alliance that was born of both necessity and shared interest, which would only deepen throughout time. This collaboration harkened back to Ferrus Manus' early experiences on Medusa, where the harsh environments had shaped his leadership with technological mastery over the course of the entirety of the Great Crusade. These ties would grow stronger and stronger as the Iron Hands would continue to fight alongside their Mechanicum allies in order to counter threats that required both their technological innovation and the engineering expertise of the Mechanicum. The Legion's relationship with the Mechanicum was mutually beneficial. The Iron Hands provided valuable expertise in weaponry and armor, while the Mechanicum shared their vast resources and technological know-how along with their manufacturing capabilities. And as a result, the Iron Hands quickly became renowned not just for their martial prowess, but for their ability as artificers and weaponsmiths. These skills allowed them to innovate new forms of armaments and defenses in the midst of combat, often developing counters to previously unknown enemy technology. When facing weapons that threatened the Legion's very survival, the Iron Hands were quick to analyze and appropriate these technologies, working alongside the Mechanicum to reverse engineer and replicate them for the Imperium's use, which they were able to do at a much greater rate of success than any other legion or faction within the Imperium, sans the Emperor himself. As the Great Crusade continued, the Iron Hands found themselves working alongside various other legions as well, often as shock troops in major campaigns. In some instances, Ferrus Manus was called upon to take overarching command of the battlefield's very operations, even overseeing other Primarchs' joint campaigns. These efforts would go on to foster strong allegiances and friendships with other legions, particularly with the Emperor's children, whose Primarch Fulgrim had already formed a deep bond of respect with Ferrus Manus, and came to rely heavily on his tactical genius. However, not all alliances would prove to be as harmonious as this one. The Iron Hands' growing reputation and their panache for discipline, along with their sometimes overly direct approach to warfare, bred some resentment within certain quarters. Amongst them, the most significant would be the Alpha Legion, whose highly covert and manipulative methods clashed greatly with the Iron Hand's blunt, effective tactics, resulting in friction occasionally threatening to spill over into outright conflict, leaving a lingering sense of mistrust and discord between the two legions. Despite this, the Iron Hand's reputation as one of the most reliable and destructive forces of the Great Crusade would endure, as the Iron Hands would become to be viewed as more than just a legion. They became the embodiment of their Primarch's will, a relentless, unshakable, cold, and calculating force that would crush any obstacle in their way. Despite their many triumphs and unparalleled, almost inhuman efficiency, for which they were known to execute their campaigns with, it became evident that over time the Iron Hands were not suited for every aspect of the Great Crusade. The 10th Legion, once cautious of the costs of their tactics when engaging with allies, had grown indifferent to such considerations. In their pursuit for the greater goal of unifying humanity and bringing about a lasting eternal peace, the Iron Hands embraced a brutal philosophy. The price of victory, no matter how bloody, was justified in the long run. This mindset led them to earn a reputation not only amongst the Imperial army but also their fellow legionaries for being belligerent, impatient, and lacking subtlety, which was often a requisite in complex warfare. Their direct approach, while effective, made them an increasingly unpopular legion, with those who preferred more diplomatic, less violent methods and more tactful, along with more tactically sound military tactics. As the years passed, the Iron Hand's reputation for ruthlessness would solidify further and further still. However, this was not seen in the same light as the unbridled bloodlust of the World Eaters, the catastrophic cost of war waged by the Death Guard, or the unpredictable nature of the White Scars. The Iron Hand's indifference to collateral damage caused by their campaigns, along with their single-mindedness and their overwhelming focus on conquest rather than liberation, set them apart. They became conquerors, not liberators, a distinction that the Legion readily accepted, but which left a bad taste with many of the other legions. Ferrus Manus himself viewed the Great Crusade as a straightforward task: expand the Imperium's borders and crush its enemies without concern for the political machinations or ramifications of the imperial court, all the while ignoring the pursuit of glory. In fact, he once famously summed up his approach to the crusade as, "We make war and move on, and again until nothing breathes which stands against us. All else is sophistry and pretty lies." The Iron Hands' disdain for politics and diplomacy, along with the subtleties of the imperial effort, became an increasingly apparent detriment as the Great Crusade progressed. While other legions engaged in efforts to win the hearts and minds of their newly unified world, the Iron Hands had little interest in such pursuits, as they believed their role was clear: to bring war to the enemies of humanity and leave the aftermath, the rebuilding, and the restoration of order, along with the nurturing of those conquered, to others who were more suited for the task. Their focus and methods essentially ignored all these aspects of the Great Crusade. As the Great Crusade would wear on, the Iron Hands were in a constant service at the front lines, often at the head of their own battle groups, task forces of compliance, or parts of larger expeditionary fleets, fighting alongside other legions as needed. Over a century of service under their Primarch, the amount of victories the Iron Hands had would become difficult to quantify, not only because of their sheer volume, but due to the Legion's growing insular nature. More than once, the Legion's operations were conducted in secrecy, and the details of said campaigns were rarely shared with the wider Imperium. To the public eye, the Iron Hands presented themselves as cold, implacable machines, calculating and powerful engines of war, uninterested in the trivial concerns of the greater humanity within politics or even glory. In fact, the Iron Hands took a great care to keep their affairs shrouded in secrecy and anonymity. Their internal operations were often kept so private that many of their victories remain as of yet unrecorded, their achievements known only to those directly involved. This was not an an act of pride or arrogance alone, but a reflection on their deep-seated belief in the singularity of their purpose, to destroy the enemies of the Imperium without distraction or deviation. In this way, the Iron Hands epitomized the relentless and unforgiving nature of war, all the while focusing on the eradication of all threats to the future of humanity. During the Great Crusade, many human worlds, and in some cases entire interstellar empires, resisted the Emperor's vision for the Imperium. Driven by either fear, fanaticism, or pride, they would resist. Amongst these defiant powers was the solar empire of Grendiel, located at the edge of the Dominion of Storms to the galactic east. This empire, comprising of 11 inhabited worlds, had thrived on the industrial power inherited from the Age of Strife, and its military aristocracy had become both formidable and deeply entrenched in their defiance of the Imperium's greater cause. The Empire's strength made it a tempting target for the Emperor's forces, who sought to incorporate it into the growing Imperium. Recognizing the Empire's potential, the Emperor directed the 413th Expeditionary Fleet to take the first step into incorporating the Empire by initiating diplomatic negotiations. A full imperial delegation, accompanied by an honor guard of 1,000 sons, was dispatched to Grendiel. Initially, talks between both parties appeared rather promising. However, it quickly became apparent that the lords of the system were playing a dangerous game of obstruction, likely to stall for the time they needed while secretly preparing for war. This suspicion would be confirmed when the 1,000 Sons detachment detected an attempt to subvert their minds through a psychic influence. The 1,000 Sons responded with lethal force, eliminating the delegation and allowing Imperial forces to withdraw, bringing world of the treacherous ambush to the wider Imperium. In response to this unprovoked assault, the Emperor dispatched Master Ulan Cirrus of the Ultramarines Legion to lead the 413th Expeditionary Fleet against Grendiel, accompanied by a strong Imperial army contingent, including Marion Arsman and Tyrannic Petalis, as well as a demi-legio of Titan Legio Articus. They would be set out to neutralize this threat. The Imperial forces swiftly overcame the defenses of the Empire's outer worlds, establishing a blockade in orbit. However, the Ultramarines attempted to launch an assault on their prime world. Unfortunately, this would lead to a rather difficult encounter, as they faced formidable resistance, fueled by a powerful and unfamiliar SCC which provided rather advanced weaponry and vehicles. These advanced weapons allowed them to repel the Imperium's forces, causing them to have to retreat. Nearly half of the Titan Demi-Legio was destroyed in the engagement, and the Ultramarines suffered catastrophic casualties. Worse still, 500,000 Imperial Army soldiers lay dead. With their assault halted, the Ultramarines called for reinforcements, and Ferrus Manus, along with his Iron Hands, answered the call. Leading an armada comprised of both Iron Hands and Emperor's children, Ferrus Manus brought a new war host to bear on Grendiel. The Emperor's children would launch a diversionary assault, sowing chaos and destruction across the world, all the while leaving the infrastructure largely intact. Taking advantage of this diversion, Ferrus Manus led his own Iron Hands directly in a relentless assault on the world's industrial zones in order to take them over with the least amount of damage to them. The Iron Hands would engage in a brutal campaign of attrition, fighting 1,000 separate engagements across the surface of the very world simultaneously. The lords of this small pocket empire, realizing that their resistance was futile, offered up an unconditional surrender to the Imperium. Yet Ferrus Manus, driven by the belief in the importance of absolute submission, refused to accept this, as he ordered his legion to press on the final assault upon the capital world's capital city. The Ultramarines, seeking redemption for their earlier failure, requested the honor of leading the charge into the enemy's citadel, which Ferrus Manus graciously granted. However, the price was steep, as the defenders, unwilling to surrender without a final stand, mounted a rather fierce counterattack, costing the Ultramarines dearly. Their losses were rather significant, but in the end, the lords of Grendiel paid the price for their transgressions. After the fall of the ruling class, Ferrus Manus delivered a chilling command: "It is done." With the conquest complete, the Iron Hands and their entire fleet departed from the system. Though the planet faced immediate hardship and famine, this system would become a valuable addition to the Imperium, serving as a future model for imperial compliance. The once defiant empire, now broken and pacified, would stand and be made as witness to the testament to the cost of defiance against the Emperor's will, a will enforced by the dreaded Iron Hands. There was also the tale of Valtel Geron Tentrus, which stands as one of the most tragic and shocking incidents of the Great Crusade. When the Imperium first entered the Ordani cluster, the forces of the Emperor encountered Terentus, a formidable warlord commanding a vast dominion. Faced with the overwhelming might of the Imperium, Terentus, calculating and clever as ever, chose the path for survival and surrendered to the Imperium's forces. His decision, however, was marked by a beginning of a rise that would see him wield power and influence in the galaxy far greater than he had previously. Over the course of the next 5 decades, Terentus expanded his reach, conquering worlds in the name of the Emperor, establishing himself as a warlord of far greater renown than he had ever had before. In the height of his power, he was a figure of rather profound influence within the Imperium, as his conquests brought him into the good graces of some of the Emperor's most powerful figures, including that of Malcador the Sigillite. He also earned the respect of many of the Emperor's sons, the Primarchs, who saw him as a potential long-lived ally. But behind this veneer of loyalty, he had begun to cultivate a darker ambition. When the power of the Imperium had firmly solidified and the Great Crusade had spread its reach, Terentus began to deviate from his own oath of allegiance. Instead of working to consolidate the Emperor's gains, he turned against the Imperium and began a Contra Crusade, a campaign to seize already compliant worlds and forge a new empire for himself. His rebellion came as a shock to many, including the Imperium's highest authorities. In response to this act of treason, the Imperium mobilized its forces to deal with the rising threat. Horus, the War Master and Primarch of the Luna Wolves, was chosen to lead this effort to crush a rebellion once loyal, to send the strongest message possible and assure that no one would consider betraying the Emperor's trust again. To ensure the traitor's defeat, Horus commanded a consolidation and coalition of forces including the Luna Wolves Legion, along with the Iron Hands, the Night Lords, and the Alpha Legion. The campaign against this once loyal man and his forces was rather brutal and unrelenting. Terentus's rebel empire, was once vast and powerful, began to unravel under the weight of the Imperium's and the Legion's great might. The Night Lords, renowned for their terror tactics, were sent first to strike at the heart of the rebel forces, decimating their warlords and terrifying Terentus's realm. The Iron Hands, with their mastery of machines and siege tactics, along with the fearsome Ordo Reductor, were unleashed upon the Bastion worlds, which held the traitors' last remaining strongholds. These worlds, once proud and defiant, fell to the relentless assault. Cities were obliterated and structures reduced to rubble and molten slag. That and the air itself was poisoned with the toxins of war. At the height of the campaign, Horus himself took the lead to bring an end to this pathetic rebellion. With a cadre of 50 elite Justarian warriors in Terminator plate, he teleported directly above the bridge of Terentus's flagship, where he confronted the traitor directly, and in a final swift yet brutal confrontation, Horus struck the man down with the talon that would eventually slay a brother, extinguishing the man's plans for rebellion. With the leader of the rebellion slain, the Imperium quickly turned their forces' attention to rooting out the remnants of his empire, leaving behind naught but smoldering ruins. The traitor's fall marked the end for the rebellion, but the devastation left in his wake was a reminder at the cost of defiance. In the aftermath, Horus ensured that the remains of Tentrus would serve as a reminder to all those who considered betrayal. The gold-dipped skull of this once proud warlord was sent to Terra as a final symbol of retribution. A messenger bearing the ghastly trophy relayed Horus's chilling message to the Emperor: "So perish all traitors." What sweet irony would these words be merely a few years later? The Ulnar Crusade remains one of the Imperium's most defining campaigns, in particular those within the realm of the Great Crusade. This was a colossal imperial assault against the Orc Empire, ruled by Overlord Uruk, situated within the Ulnar system of the Ulnar sector. The creatively named Ulnar was the capital world of this Orc Empire, and it stood as a major stronghold of the Greenskin menace. The crusade to conquer this marked not only the annihilation of the largest Orc concentration ever faced by Imperial forces, but it also marked the highest point of the Great Crusade and their mission to reunite the fractured colony worlds of humanity. With the victory at Ullanor secured in a clash of blood and iron, the Imperium called for a grand triumph of honor. The immense valor demonstrated by all the warriors within this campaign, both mortal and astartes, would be celebrated, as 14 of the legions stood at Ullanor, alongside their primarchs, 9 towering figures whose very presence commanded awe and respect. It was in the wake of this spectacular victory that the Emperor made a monumentous decision. Horus Lupercal, the Primarch of the Luna Wolves, was appointed to the title of War Master. This title granted Horus supreme command over all of the Emperor's armies, including authority over the other Primarchs and their expeditionary fleets. The elevation of Horus to War Master was a turning point for many. As the newly appointed supreme commander of all military forces, Horus would oversee the continuation of the Great Crusade, guiding the Imperium's military efforts across the galaxy. But the Emperor's decision was met with surprise and speculation by those present. In a shocking proclamation, the Emperor would then announce his intent to return to Terra, where he was to devote his attention to a secret project he believed would benefit all of mankind. This revelation, paired with Horus's newfound authority, left many questioning how things would go on from there. Amongst those who witnessed this event was Ferrus Manus, and despite what many would think, regardless of his seniority and his overall place in the Emperor's military structure as it stood, did not show any signs of dissatisfaction or even satisfaction at Horus's ascension. Ferrus Manus and his Iron Hands Legion would continue their service alongside Horus and the Luna Wolves without any form of enmity, all the while being led by Ferrus Manus, who resisted the pull of rebellion. Unlike some of the other legions who were compromised by their leaders' ambitions or ideological shifts, the Iron Hands did not fall to the sway of Horus's treachery or even their own ambition. It remains a point of curiosity as to why the traitors believed so strongly that they could sway the Iron Hands to their cause, while they did not attempt the same with other legions. The reasons behind this belief, whether due to the reputation of the Iron Hands themselves, their similarities to the Iron Warriors, and not just in name, or some other factor, remains unclear and may never be fully understood. One can only speculate that Horus saw in Ferrus and his legion a powerful force that could tip the balance of the conflict to come. If the Iron Hands had chosen to side with the traitors, the trajectory of history would likely be irrevocably altered, and the outcome of the Horus Heresy might have been starkly different. As the Great Crusade went on, the Iron Hands encountered a fleet-based civilization known as the astartes, comprised of both humans and Xenos. Despite their shared adherence to the Imperial truth and the belief in the Emperor's vision for humanity being united, the astartes refused to accept the offer extended by the Iron Hands to abandon their alien allies and join the burgeoning human Imperium. Their rejection was met with a swift and severe retribution. The Iron Hands, in their customary fashion, passed judgment on the astartes for their defiance. In the months that would follow, the Iron Hands launched a series of strikes against the nomadic fleet, seeking to obliterate them. However, this fleet proved to be more than capable of evading the astartes' assaults. Skilled in naval warfare, they managed to outmaneuver the Iron Hands fleet, even inflicting significant damage to the Iron Hands strike cruiser Ferrum. This resilience forced the Imperium to call in reinforcements. In particular, the Emperor's Children, part of the 28th Expeditionary Fleet, responded, and together the Iron Hands and the Emperor's Children began a concerted effort to crush the astartes once and for all. Despite knowing the power of the Imperial fleets hunting them, the astartes refused to flee the sector, and eventually the Imperium would find out why. They had a singular strategic reason for staying within the solar system. They had a hidden solar collector array which allowed them to harvest fuel from a nearby star. This was vital to their continued operation of their fleet. The Iron Hands and the Emperor's Children, having discovered this critical flaw in the astartes' military strategy, set about dismantling the fuel stations. The attack on these vital supply points would finally draw the astartes' fleet into an open and outright battle, where they sought to avoid annihilation at the hands of the Imperium's superior military forces. What followed was a brutal naval engagement, and as the conflict raged, Primarch Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children found himself under a heavy assault while aboard aboard his personal flagship, Firebird. In response, Ferrus Manus and the Iron Hands moved to aid his brother, dispatching his flagship, the Fist of Iron, to provide urgent aid to his beleaguered brother's Firebird. In a rare moment of close cooperation between Primarchs, Ferrus and Fulgrim worked together to engage the Diasporax forces in a concerted combined assault. Seeking to restore his wounded pride, Fulgrim led a boarding action aboard the Diasporax ship, where his legion encountered a bloody assault, cutting down enemy forces with brutal efficiency. However, victory would be denied to Fulgrim when the Diasporax ship's bridge was captured by one of his subordinate commanders, and he was not allowed to claim it himself. This act of heroism, done in the spirit of saving his brother, was lost on Fulgrim. The perception of Ferrus Manus' intervention was clouded by the growing arrogance and nigh unending pride of Fulgrim. In the aftermath of the battle, Fulgrim's resentment festered and grew as he struggled to understand the altruistic nature of Ferrus' actions, instead interpreting them as though the intent was personal humiliation. In part, this was due to his growing connection to the chaos-tainted Layer Blade, a weapon that would come to define Fulgrim's eventual corruption, and would be a large part of his further twisted judgment. What Fulgrim saw as Ferrus' attempt to undermine him were in truth merely jests designed to puncture Fulgrim's swollen sense of self-importance and remind him of the humility they both once shared. What Fulgrim could not see was what his pride had obscured. Ferrus had acted selflessly, offering his help not out of pride or desire to overshadow his brother, but out of true camaraderie and care. The Gorgon's actions, though misunderstood, were not motivated by competition or ego, but as a sense of duty and brotherhood. However, this would matter little to Fulgrim, as chaos had already tainted his soul. Following the Emperor's departure from the Great Crusade after the triumph at Ulnor, the Iron Hands, along with the Death Guard and the Salamander's legions, took part in the pacification of the Eldar-controlled world designated as 1544. The task itself was assigned to them due to the necessity to integrate the planet's desert regions into Imperial compliance. However, the campaign was not to unfold as planned. The inhospitable terrain of the world and the elusive battle tactics of the Eldar hindered the Imperial forces. These complications took a heavy toll on Ferrus Manus' legion in particular, leaving them well behind schedule in their efforts to purge the world properly. The Primarch was deeply troubled by the apparent weakness of the Imperial Army's regiments assigned to assist them. Their inability to endure the brutal desert conditions served as an affirmation of the Legion's maxim that the flesh was weak. Determined not to lose face in front of his fellow Primarchs, Mortarion and Vulcan, Ferrus Manus made the decision to abandon the Imperial Army forces should they fail to keep pace with his astartes. To this end, he dispatched his son, Bion Henkros, to liaise with the regiment's commanding officer, informing him of Ferrus' intentions. This message, however, was not without emotional weight, as Herencross felt a twinge of remorse in delivering it. Meanwhile, Ferrus Manus was beset by troubling dreams, visions that troubled his mind and cast doubt into his legion's effectiveness. Amongst the worries was the possible interference of Eldar witchcraft, which he feared might influence his Astartes' performance, completely putting out of whack his tactical calculations. He confided of these anxieties to his first captain, Gabriel Santor, but did not reveal his deeper unease about the planet itself. The sooner the campaign concluded, he believed, the better, and the quicker his legion could leave this cursed world behind. Unbeknownst to Ferrus, two Eldar had already taken interest in his fate. One of them, seeing the potential for a positive outcome, sought to intervene, while the other cautioned against tampering with the Primarch's path, declaring, "Stone cannot bend, it can only break." The Iron Hands would press onwards into the deep desert. Eventually, they would arrive at a rather suspicious valley, a place Ferrus Manus felt held a significant importance. Though he could not explain why, he would feel reluctant to proceed without a scouting force. He was advised by Herencross to wait for the arrival of the Imperial Army forces, who possessed the necessary units and expertise for such an undertaking. This would also help to bolster the morale for the Imperial Army regiments, giving them a sense of purpose in this arduous campaign. However, Ferrus Manus, unwilling to delay any further, dismissed Herencross's advice and ordered his forces into the valley. As soon as the bulk of the Iron Hand's forces descended, a sudden darkness would engulf them, followed by violent weather that sowed confusion and disarray. The Eldar, lying in ambush, struck swiftly and in close quarters combat, allowing them to deploy mysterious weapons capable of overriding the bionics of the Iron Hands, blinding those who had bionic eyes, and controlling the bionic limbs of the warriors who had replaced them, in order to turn their weapons against their own brethren. The battle seemed all but lost, if not for the timely arrival of Herrencross's rearguard force, which was able to neutralize the Eldar warlocks responsible for this psychic attack, driving them into retreat. Yet just as the Iron Hands began to regroup, Ferrus Manus was found to be missing, leading to a search being launched. And it was soon discovered that Ferrus had wandered into a cavern deep within the valley, where he was assaulted by a barrage of prescient visions. These visions filled him with knowledge of death, showing the destruction of his legion, his astartes, and even himself. In the midst of this, Ferrus Manus saw a metaphorical representation of his fellow Primarchs, and was struck by an overwhelming sense of betrayal as he gazed upon a statue of Fulgrim. At the same time, Ferrus could feel a malevolent force following him, an ominous serpentine entity that seemed to be stalking him all throughout the cavernous halls. Ignoring the vision's warnings, Ferrus pressed onwards, intent in exploring the cavern further. Meanwhile, First Captain Santor, accompanied by 50 of the Legion's Morlock Terminators, initiated a search for Ferrus, while the legendary Shadrach Medusan, another officer, took command of the Legion's forces and continued the campaign's primary objective in order to destroy the Eldar node complex. However, Santor's search was met with resistance from a powerful protective energy field, which was a formidable Eldar defense that delayed the Iron Hand's progress. Ferrus Manus had continued undeterred, venturing deeper and deeper still into the cavern. Eventually, he was confronted by a serpentine creature that had been haunting him, a massive silver worm. The ensuing battle was fierce, with Ferrus coming dangerously close to death several times. During this confrontation, Ferrus was struck by a sense of deja vu, and a vague, unbidden vision in his mind, along with the words Angel Exterminatus echoing throughout his mind, constantly, ad infinitum. Drawing inspiration from his brother Vulcan, Ferrus managed to wound the worm and force it to retreat. Elsewhere, the two Eldar discussed their intervention. While one lamented the failure to prevent the intrusion of chaos, the other was resigned to the inevitable reality. Whether Ferrus succeeded or not, their purpose would not be thwarted. Back on the surface, Brian Herrencross's force of Imperial Army troops would continue to suffer heavy casualties as they attempted to breach the Eldar's defenses. Herrencross himself would be grievously wounded, but his bravery ensured that the Eldar threat was significantly weakened. Just as Herrencross's forces were on the verge of annihilation, Ferrus Manus reappeared, emerging from the caverns, helping to turn the tide of battle, with Santor's reinforcements also joining and arriving shortly thereafter. The Iron Hands would be able to secure victory. As a sign of respect to the surviving Imperial Army troops, Ferrus officially inducted them into the Iron Hands as Chainveil, the first member of the Legion's mortal auxilia forces, living proof that not all flesh is weak. When questioned about his absence, Ferrus Manus remained tight-lipped about it all, dismissing the event as insignificant. Later, when Vulcan made contact with Ferrus and led his forces deeper into the jungle regions of the planet, the Eldar reflected on their failure. With the population of 1544 unwilling to accept the Emperor's vision of truth, Vulcan would be forced to make a grim decision. The planet, once a bastion of resistance, was now to be scoured by flame and renamed Caldera, a dead world, as it was prepared to be terraformed and resettled into the Imperium's service. Eventually, the Horus Heresy would come, and in the early days of the Horus Heresy, as Horus began his rebellion on Isstvan V, Ferrus Manus found himself in an unimaginable position. His closest friend Fulgrim was now an emissary of chaos and his enemy. Ordered by Horus himself, Fulgrim was tasked with swaying Ferrus Manus to the side of the traitor legions. At this time, Fulgrim had already sent the bulk of the 3rd Legion and the 28th Expeditionary Fleet to rendezvous with Horus on Isstvan, while he personally led a small contingent to assist the Iron Hands in retaking the orc-controlled world of Culminating. The bond between the Iron Hands and the Emperor's children had run rather deep, forged over years of brotherhood and shared campaigns. Fulgrim, believing that he had a fraternal connection with Ferrus deep enough that it would allow him to show his brother the righteousness of Horus's cause, arranged a private meeting aboard Ferrus's flagship, the creatively named Fist of Iron. But what Fulgrim had hoped would be a diplomatic turn was quickly shattered by Ferrus's outrage. The Gorgon, as he was known, was staunchly loyal to the Emperor, and the very suggestion of betrayal was enough to ignite his fury, causing him to lose his head. In the sanctity of Ferrus's anvilism, the two Primarchs clashed violently. Ferrus, unable to fathom Fulgrim's fall to chaos, made his stance clear, drawing his weapon, hoping to stop the rebellion before it could take root. His necrodermis hands clashed with Fulgrim's golden sword, triggering a devastating explosion that left Ferrus unconscious. Fulgrim, however, would choose not to deliver the fatal blow just yet. Despite the urging of the Slaneshi demon now fully corrupting his soul, he could not bring himself to kill his dearest and oldest friend. Instead, in a moment of grim sorrow, he took Forgebreaker away from Ferrus. Fulgrim then left Ferrus behind, signaling his Phoenix Guard to massacre the Iron Hand's elite Morlock Terminators, who were Ferrus's personal guard, before departing aboard his own assault craft into the Firebird. As Fulgrim's forces launched their escape into the warp, they fired down on the Iron Hand's ship, crippling the 52nd Expeditionary Fleet in the process. The betrayal cut deeply, and Ferrus's fury was unimaginable. Then the message from the Emperor arrived, relayed by Rogel Dorn. Time had come for the Loyalists to strike back. The Iron Hands, alongside the Raven Guard, the Salamanders, and others, were sent to confront Horus and his traitors on the world of Isstvan V, with the task of crushing the rebellion in its totality. A second wave would be comprised of the Night Lords, the Iron Warriors, the Alpha Legion, and the Word Bearers, who would be sent to support the assault of the initial three Loyalist legions. The Loyalist fleet managed to reach orbit above Isstvan V, and it would be then that the armies of the Emperor would descend upon the planet. Thousands upon thousands of drop pods and stormbirds were launched. As the first wave, under the command of Ferrus Manus, hit the ground, Vulcan's salamanders would assault the flank of the traitors' forces. All the while, Corvus Corax and the Raven Guard would strike at the rightmost segment of Horus's defenses, accompanied by First Captain Gabriel Santor and 10 full companies of elite Morlock Terminators to spearhead the assault to the heart of the enemy's lines. The forces would clash with a fury that was as of yet unmatched, as 40,000 Loyalist Astartes would face against 30,000 traitor Astartes. But Horus was no fool. He had anticipated the Loyalist forces' chosen Dropsite, and his forces had been ready. The traitors would spring their trap, and the Battle of Isstvan V would become a bloodbath of unimaginable scale. At this point, the battle for Isstvan V was nothing short of apocalyptic, and it would become a slaughterhouse of an unprecedented scale, as once brotherly forces turned against each other in a maelstrom of rage, betrayal, and bloodshed, leaving the battlefield littered with the wreckage of fallen warriors and broken machines. The cries of dying echoed throughout the air, underscored by the deafening steps of massive Titan war engines of the machine god. The colossal machines, their purpose was to enact death upon an industrial scale, trampled across the planet's surface, leaving naught but devastation in their wake. The blood of both loyal and treacherous traitors mingled, staining the earth beneath them as the fight would rage on. Amongst the chaos, the shadowy adepts of the Dark Mechanicum unleashed horrific perversions of lost technology, using weapons and devices pilfered from the ancient Artrelian technocracy. They would unleash unspeakable monstrosities upon the Loyalist forces. These twisted technologies and technological monstrosities tore through the ranks of the Emperor's Astartes, furthering the carnage across the Urgal Depression, which had become all but the focal point of death for hundreds of warriors who perished each and every passing moment, as the specter of an inevitable death loomed large above these warring factions, casting a heavy pall upon every combatant. Though traitor forces initially held firm, their line began to buckle beneath the relentless pursuit and pressure of the Loyalist assault. To them, it was clear that the smallest shift in fortune could turn the tide decisively in the favor of the Emperor's forces, but fate had more in store for them than just that. As a new wave of attackers descended upon the battlefield, the reserve forces, initially expected to bolster the Loyalists' ranks, arrived with their own devastating surprise. The second wave of astartes descended upon the northern landing zone of the Urgal Depression. Hundreds of stormbirds and thunderhawks roared throughout the skies, their armored hulls gleaming under the planet's dusky skies. These new forces, however, were not loyalists, as they had originally been assumed to be. The Night Lords, the Iron Warriors, the Word Bearers, and the Alpha Legion, all once some of the greatest champions of the Emperor, had already pledged their loyalty to Horus and Chaos in secret, and they would represent a force larger than the one that had initially begun the assault on Isstvan V. Their strength untested, yet their weapons were ready for the fray. Fresh and unbloodied, these traitor legions arrived with a resolve forged in secret treachery. Meanwhile, the Iron Hands, Raven Guard, and Salamanders apparently secured the drop site for the traitors, unknowingly. The ferocity of Ferrus Manus, still seething with rage at his earlier betrayal, led him to abandon the council of his fellow commanders, Corvus, Corax, and Vulcan, his mind set on one goal: to confront Fulgrim in personal hand-to-hand combat. Therefore, Ferrus hurled himself towards the retreating traitor forces, hoping to bring his once close brother to justice. His veteran forces, comprised of the Iron Hands elite Terminators and Dreadnoughts, followed him into the battle, their ranks swarming behind their furious Primarch. What had begun as a concentrated and coordinated assault on the traitor forces quickly escalated into one of the largest engagements ever seen in the history of the Great Crusade. With the arrival of the secret traitor legions, the number of combatants on the field swelled massively, pushing the total count of Astartes warriors involved in the conflict well over 60,000, leading the battlefield to become a maelstrom of blood, metal, and fire, as brother fought brother in a cataclysmic clash. For all the wrong reasons, the Battle of Isstvan V would become one of the most remembered in Imperial history, as one of the most unbelievably tragic and epic confrontations ever fought. As the battle raged on top of the desolate Urgal Depression, Fulgrim watched his brother Ferrus Manus wrathfully push deeper and deeper into the heart of the traitor, deeper and deeper still into the heart of the traitor defenses. In the midst of this chaos, backlit by the strobing lights of artillery fire and the flaring explosions of war, Ferrus was truly a sight to behold, his figure a symbol of both vengeance and rage. The reflection of slaughter danced in his silver eyes and hands, a cold brilliance that mirrored the firestorm around him. For a fleeting moment, Fulgrim wondered if Ferrus would pause, if his brother might turn and join the forces of the Raven Guard and the Salamanders, leading to his survival. But he quickly dismissed the thought, as Ferrus was consumed by an aggrieved sense of honor, his fury too great to be restrained. Fulgrim watched as the last of his Phoenix Guard stood poised, golden halberds held low, waiting to face the brunt of the Iron Hands' charge. Ferrus Manus and his elite Morlock Terminators tore through the remnants of the traitor's defenses. The black plates of Ferrus's armor were stained with the blood of his enemies. His figure and that of his Terminators was unstoppable in their advance. The Phoenix Guard steeled themselves for the clash, bracing for impact. They knew the danger the Morlocks represented, one of the most advanced variants of Terminator armor available, a massive, nigh unstoppable warrior encased in near impenetrable armor. As the two sides clashed, a struggle for power and rage ensued. The scream of lightning claws echoed across the battlefield, sparking in the air as they met the golden blades of the Phoenix Guard's halberds. Electric fire burst forth from the weapons of both sides, lighting up the darkness of the Urgal Depression in a brilliant and deadly storm. It was a battle of sheer fury and wrath, turning brothers into enemies, as Ferrus stormed through the chaos in order to face Fulgrim. Fulgrim stood above the melee, untouched by the violence surrounding him, his eyes remaining fixed on his brother, who in the midst of the carnage strode forward with a singular focus. Ferrus had long yearned for this moment of reckoning. Ever since Fulgrim had betrayed the Emperor and joined Horus's cause, the rivalry between the two had grown deep and too bitter for any form of reconciliation. The possibility of this being their final confrontation was all but secured. and it would end with the death of one of them, as only one would walk away from this battlefield alive. The battle that would become known as the Dropsite Massacre of Isstvan V was one of the most catastrophic events for the Loyalists throughout the entirety of the Horus Heresy, in particular for the Iron Hands, who had been fueled by an overwhelming sense of anger and betrayal, not just of Fulgrim, but of their brethren in the Emperor's children. As the traitor legions planned to usurp the Emperor, Ferrus Manus and his sons, fueled by vengeance, urged the Raven Guard, led by Corvus Corax, and the Salamanders, commanded by their Primarch, Vulcan, to move forward and continue to strike the traitors before any reinforcements could arrive. However, this tactic came from emotion, not logic, and the two Primarchs held their forces back to reinforce their positions, fearing that Ferrus had lost his head to anger. At the heart of the Loyalists' remaining assault were the elite Morlock Terminators of Ferrus Manus, now separated from the other two Loyalist legions. The 10th Legion's veterans formed a central spearhead for the Loyalist charge, as foolhardy as that was. In the midst of this bloody engagement, it seems the two Loyalist legions who decided to move to defensive positions were right, as it was no longer a simple war of attacker and defender, as the remaining forces who had sided with chaos had arrived on the battlefield, began slaughtering and began to pick off the fractured Loyalist forces. The actions of Ferrus Manus and his Iron Hands, while successful in slaying large amounts of traitors, led to the complete fracture of the Loyalist lines. The moment of reckoning had come. Ferrus Manus, his eyes blazing with fury and conviction, taunted Fulgrim for his betrayal, and condemned his brother for siding with Horus, the self-proclaimed War Master of Chaos, and for turning against the Emperor and his brothers. In Ferrus's mind, the War Master's cause was doomed to failure. Horus had been defeated, his forces broken, and the arrival of 4 more Loyalist legions would surely crush any hopes of his rebellion. Ferrus, believing himself to be the voice of reason, viewed Fulgrim as delusional, his judgment clouded by pride and ambition. But Fulgrim had a different truth to reveal. With a cold smile, he shook his head, savoring the moment of his final betrayal. He reminded Fulgrim that it was not Horus, but Ferrus himself who had misjudged the situation. The battle was already lost for the Loyalists. He claimed that the inevitable consequences would soon become clear. To make his point, Fulgrim gestured towards the northern ridge of the Urgal Depression. It was then that Ferrus's eyes widened in disbelief, as he saw the scale of the traitor's strength. What had begun as a desperate assault by the Loyalists was now overshadowed by the overwhelming number of newly arrived traitor legions. The landing zone, to be the site for further Loyalist reinforcements, had become a staging ground for a devastating counterattack. Ferrus realized too late that it was not Horus who had been foolish, but he and his brothers who had walked into a trap they could never hope to escape. Meanwhile, the Raven Guard and the Salamanders, led by their Primarchs respectively, had fought their way back towards the drop site. With their forces battered and bloodied, they sought to regroup, hoping to join the reinforcements of the second wave of Loyalists. Yet despite their calls for aid, no response came. The astartes positioned on the northern ridge had gone silent. The lines of communication cut as the exhausted warriors of the Raven Guard and the Salamanders approached, unaware of the horrors that awaited them. Without warning, the true nature of Horus's treachery was revealed. A flare shot into the sky from the Black Fortress where Horus had made his command bunker. It exploded in a hellish reddish glow, signaling the official reveal of their devastating betrayal. And suddenly, thousands of bolters opened fire, unleashing a maelstrom of death upon the unsuspecting Loyalists. The second wave of Astartes, the Night Lords, the Word Bearers, and the Alpha Legion had just then revealed their true loyalties, as they turned their weapons upon the Salamanders and the Raven Guard, and whatever contingent of Iron Hands were left, guarding the drop site. Hundreds of Loyalist warriors fell under the hail of bolter fire and missile barrages. The battlefield turned into a new slaughterhouse, this time for the Loyalists. As the Loyalist forces were torn apart, Ferrus Manus' Iron Hands, already embroiled with a battle against the traitors, found themselves utterly and completely surrounded. The retreating forces of Horus turned their guns upon them, and the combined might of the World Eaters, Sons of Horus, and Death Guard descended upon the veterans of the 10th Company. Though the Iron Hands fought valiantly with endless courage, they were hopelessly outnumbered, and the resistance would quickly crumble under the weight of the enemy's overwhelming forces. In the midst of this carnage, Ferrus Manus turned to face Fulgrim, his teeth bared in a snarl of fury. The two Primarchs locked eyes with each other. Their hatred for one another so thick in the air that you could cut it with a knife. What had once been one of the strongest bonds of brotherly love had dissolved into an abyss of betrayal and rage. With a roar, the two warriors lunged at each other, their weapons, the legendary Fireblade and Forgebreaker, meeting in a blazing explosion of energy. Their weapons, once forged in the days of unity, now clashed as a violent testament to their enmity. Ferrus wielded the fiery blade with a deadly precision, each strike aimed with the power of 1,000 storms. But Fulgrim, ever the consummate tactician, met each blow with the ebony haft of the massive hammer. Forgebreaker deflected Ferrus' strikes with brutal efficiency. The combat was a symphony of destruction as their monstrous weapons collided in arcs of molten energy, sending shockwaves throughout the battlefield, accidentally slaying countless astartes near the pair. Their armor, once gleaming in the light of the Emperor's glory, now bore the scars of their endless fury. Dents, scorch marks, cracks, all marked the once pristine surfaces, the unmistakable evidence of a battle between brothers who could no longer see past their hatred for each other, was clear for all to see. In the final confrontation between Ferrus Manus and Fulgrim, it was not just a battle of strength and skill. It was a collision of ideals, a tragic end to a once nigh unbreakable bond. As the two Primarchs fought, the fate of the Iron Hands was sealed through the escalating and unforgiving clash. Ferrus Manus, his body bloodied and battered, struggled to rise to his feet, the iron will within unbroken despite the toll that combat had taken out of him. With a final desperate cry, he lunged at Fulgrim, raising his flaming blade to strike at his brother's neck. But Fulgrim, drawing upon the power of an accursed sword he had taken from the temple of the lair, met this blow with an unnatural force. He was stronger than he had previously been. The demonically possessed blade rang out, blocking Ferrus' strike with its own deafening clash. The dark power now coursing through Fulgrim caused his body to visibly surge with energy, granting him a diabolical boost in strength, removing what advantage Ferrus had. He pushed against Ferrus with a brutal force. Feeling the surprise and growing desperation in his brother's resistance led to Fulgrim to lunge and surge towards his feet, his silver blade flashing, cutting through the air, and with a swift, cruel strike, the blade found its mark, sinking deep into Ferrus Manus' breastplate. The Primarch of the Iron Hands then staggered, a ragged gasp of pain causing him to crumple to his knees, the legendary Fireblade slipping from his hand as agony overtook him. Now Fulgrim, or the thing that was in Fulgrim's flesh, stood over his brother, the silver sword raised to deliver the final blow. Yet in a fleeting moment, a sliver of doubt took root in his heart. As he prepared to strike, he was confronted by the monstrous reality of his actions. The betrayal, the descent to darkness, and the weapon that had corrupted him all came rushing to his mind as he understood with devastating clarity the magnitude of his mistake upon taking the blade from the Temple of Lair. The grip on his sword would then tighten, but the weight of his conscience weighed heavily upon his limbs. He could no longer find the strength to end his brother's life. Not in this moment of revelation, but it was far too late to turn back now. The demon's influence over Fulgrim's body was at this point an absolute. Though his mind screamed for him to stop, the blade seemed to move on his own accord, as though it was guided by some malevolent force. Fulgrim's arm swung down, and the sword cleaved through Ferrus Manus' body, severing his head from his shoulders. In that instant, Ferrus Manus, one of the Emperor's most loyal and ardent sons, was no more. In a blinding flash of light, his soul left him, leaving the legacy of the Iron Hands forever altered, their Primarch slain at the hands of his own brother. The 10th Legion, which had once fought with nigh unending strength, was shattered in both body and spirit. A small group of Iron Hands warriors managed to escape the carnage, evading the closing trap of the traitor legions, fleeing with what they could, but their defeat at the Dropsite Massacre left an unhealable scar on the legion, one that would never allow them to rise to their former glory. The death of Ferrus Manus, however, would not be accepted, as the Primarch's head was not recovered, so there were some delusional enough to believe they could revive the Primarch through a mechanical conflagration of disgusting proportions, turning his corpse into a mere puppet. In the wake of Ferrus Manus' death, the Iron Hands were largely left adrift, their hearts heavy with despair, but their sorrow would deepen further still upon hearing the news that the Emperor, the father and sovereign of mankind, had fallen in battle at the hands of a corrupted Horus much later during the heresy. The realization that both the Primarch and the Emperor had been lost had left their devotion unshaken but changed. Now their anger was unquenchable, and their eyes set to the horizon for the barest hint of a traitor that they may slay. And so came the end of the Iron Hand's major role in the Horus Heresy.